What's really good, everybody? This is Nathan Albach, and welcome to the podcast where we get into people's stories and go down a bunch of rabbit holes about what's really good in the world. I just have one quick announcement to get into before we start this episode. I will be slowing down producing new episodes starting in the fall, probably to like one a month or so. I haven't been able to monetize the show. It hasn't grown enough the past year, so it's hard to justify the amount of hours I put into it production-wise with the amount of time I need to be putting elsewhere right now to help build other projects. So yeah, if you're a regular listener, I really, really appreciate you. Thanks so much for all the support. It seriously means a ton. So many more people have listened to this than I ever thought they would, and it's awesome. And yeah, I'll continue to keep everybody posted. We'll see where it goes. It's not going away, but yeah, some things will get moved around, and it's okay. You know, things happen. People change, like they write in the 4th grade yearbooks or whatever. So anyway, we'll talk more about that later. Feel free to reach out to me on social media if you have more feedback or any questions about it. Let's just get into this thing today. I had on Dale Beran, who just came out with a new book called It Came From Something Awful: How a Toxic Troll Army Accidentally Memed Donald Trump into Office. So we essentially talked about just that. We got into the book, and it essentially goes over just the origins of 4chan, how they originated from something awful, and the public-facing part of them in the early phases really was like this leftist hacker community in a way. They went by anonymous at one point and supported like Occupy Wall Street, and they trolled Scientology and like the Westboro Baptist Church, and there was this whole thing about what 4chan was. It was kind of like perceived image, and over time that shifted as the culture wars kind of came in, and things just started to change on the public facing front of the internet, so that they ended up becoming like a hub for the alt-right in the 2016 election. And yeah, we kind of got into all that and just how there was like that kind of divergence in the post-financial crisis where you had the Occupy movement, and then you also had the Tea Party movement, and alongside of them there's all these various subcultures and movements that are growing, and they kind of all collide and converge over the period of the culture wars in the past few years. So talked all about that, just what it was like in the early internet to now, how these sentiments of like anti-capitalism, anti-marketing, and just like cultural nihilism in general have evolved, and just how if depending on what end of the fence you've landed on over the years, you kind of end up in this like further left camp or this further right camp, or maybe you've always been a moderate or a centrist or whatever, and maybe that's just where you are. But how the internet and the culture wars have essentially created this spectrum of more extreme ideologies that have arisen in the past few years. So get all into that. It was super fun. Dale's a really bright guy who's really experienced in all these areas. So please buy his book, follow him on social media, and like I said, if you got any feedback or whatever for the show, feel free to reach out. Now let's get into what's really good. Dale, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hi, sure.
Well, we were just chatting a little bit before we started recording here, and there's a ton I want to get into just about, you know, your book, obviously, and the kind of the broader topics that you cover within it, from the culture wars and the sort of like history and trajectory of these platforms like Something Awful and 4chan, and how they integrate into our political discourse and all that. But before we get too far here, I guess I'm personally interested in, just from your perspective, like as someone who sought out to write this book, and as someone who's obviously versed in internet culture to a large enough degree to feel comfortable writing about the source material. Like, I'm wondering, how did you initially find yourself involved with just like these subcultures online? Like, were you personally a goon on Something Awful, what was your start?
Good question. For the most part, I fell very backwards into all of this. It was not the career trajectory I meant to take. I did not consider myself a goon on Something Awful. I recall it from the late 90s, that it was sort of that my generation, I suppose. I was just out of college when it was popular, or just out of high school when it was popular in the late 90s. And I remember going on, and I had friends who were on it. I spend a lot of time, for the most part. I had a web comic that was sort of my web presence. So sort of in the early web comic scene.
Oh, cool.
But for the most part, I wanted to be a writer, and I was writing fiction, and I was writing comic books for a great deal of my career. And so right around before Trump, like 2014, 2015, I was doing work like that. I worked on a indie game or two that never came out. And I was working with a friend of mine doing work for Cartoon Network, developing a kids' cartoon show. And then that ended. That sort of like they kind of cut off the development, and I was sort of idle for a little bit. And I wrote sort of these like Zizekian style political essays now and again because I was sort of interested in culture and politics, sort of like analyzing films and things like that. And I decided to sort of write one on 4chan because they were being very obnoxious, sort of like right around when Trump got elected. I don't know if you remember the Ghost Fire incident where there was sort of this show space out west that burned down. And in sort of response to that, the alt-right had already sort of formed on 4chan, and they were harassing artist communities, including the one that I was in Baltimore.
Oh, wow.
And I had a friend who was like, look, they're harassing us, they're harassing me. And I was trying to explain to her, like at a party, like what 4chan was and how they were losers in their mom's basement. And I was like, I guess I should write this up and sort of tell everyone. And that piece, which was really crazy because I had sort of tried to write about 4chan like 2008. I sort of always found it fascinating. They had always shown up in my webcomic logs, and they were – I knew about them from Otakon. They had the one place they met every year when they first started was my local anime convention. So I wrote an article that was like, this is who they are. This is how they evolved into the alt-right, and like these weird personalities like Milo Yiannopoulos came out of Gamergate, which was also a 4chan thing. And I thought, 400 people would read it, but the article went viral. And then, like, millions of people read it, and then it was easy at that point to sell a book on that topic, and now I've been condemned to this swamp ever since. So this is my life now. That's in conclusion.
So around that time then, when you were working in cartoons and you were sort of like on your own, on a personal level, like actively involved in media and political criticism and writing and all that, like how much around that time when you started to kind of take this pivot to make the decision to write about 4chan, how involved were you in the actual culture war space? Like not on like a personal level, I don't mean like fighting 4chan accounts or anything like that, but like how deeply were you invested in like what was going on at that time, like from like 2000, I guess 14 was Gamergate. So like from then to, and you said this article came out in 2017. So like, was this just kind of more of like a hobby for you, or was it actually becoming like on its own, becoming more of like a passion project type thing?
No, yeah. I mean, I think it was more than just sort of like a hobby or an interest. Like what the culture wars and the evolution of the alt-right and sort of the Tumblr culture of social justice, all this stuff. I mean, it affected my demographic, and I wrote in the original 4chan essay sort of how I kind of bumped up against that demographic where the 4chan coalition and the people that end up coalescing there and the alt-right too is sort of made up of men under 40 down to their teens who were sort of marginalized economically and in some sense culturally. And like I sort of spent my 20 years after college or whatever, 15 years after college, just sort of living on the margins as an artist, not making a lot of money. And partly that was a personal choice to ruin my life by becoming an artist. But I think there was another component, which was sort of demographic where, I had student loan debt, sort of like it was kind of clear that my experience was not my parents' generation experience. So there was sort of that component. So I sort of like wrote about 4chan from that perspective, which I think was something that was interesting to people that the connection hadn't been made that much before. And Gamergate too, like these things sort of bump up against my experience where that happened to be the years when I was working in indie games a little bit. I'd worked for some folks who were making some games, doing writing or doing art. And my good friend who I had made my webcomic with, David Hellman, he made a very prominent indie game called Braid. So through him, he had a lot of indie friends. He was very active in the indie community, and Gamergate was about harassing the indie game community. Mm-hmm. So when that happened, people I knew were very upset. And it was sort of very close to what I was doing, I suppose. And the webcomics too, right? Memes are chopped up pieces of webcomics, and 4chan co-opted a lot of webcomics. And in the webcomics community, these were people I knew personally, right? This was their own work. And then, of course, I had also known, it's these spaces like Something Awful and 4chan. There's sort of these nerdy spaces about that are very close, intersect with the webcomics community of the early 2000s and the nerdy men who play video games from that era. So, yeah, I mean, it was all sort of very close. And I was for years, I was fascinated by 4chan because it was so weird. Mm-hmm. It was just so weird, and it was impossible to describe. I kind of had failed to describe it. For years, I had just spent time thinking about it. And when I finally wrote the essay in 2017, it really started with this moment where I had gone in 2008 to the Scientology protests when they had become anonymous hacker collective. And I went with a reporter's notebook, and I brought my friend along, and I'm dude, 4chan's meeting, they're coming out of their mom's basement. And I had wrote to Moot, Christopher Poole, the founder of 4chan. I was trying to interview him. I'm no one's writing about this. Someone's got to write about this. And I went, and it was so weird, and I had no idea how to frame it, what it was, right?
Yeah.
So it was kind of something that I was always interested in writing. I thought I'd kind of missed the boat. I thought oh, it's dead now after Anonymous. It sort of moved on, but it turns out it has this weird second or third life as a community of fascists because we live in an upside down hell world now.
Right. Well, and it's wild too, just to look at the past several years and see how much of media and journalists and even just everyday people are sort of retroactively digging back through the past decade or 15 years or so and trying to uncover all of this information and uncover what these subcultures meant and who these people were and how they evolved into the groups that we see today, in the rise of, in the aftermath of the 2016 election. And I think what's interesting about at least the premise of your book and the title itself, how so much of this originated from the website Something Awful. So, I mean, can you, before we jump too deep down the rabbit hole with just the actual cultural words themselves, maybe briefly at least, can we just get into what Something Awful was as a forum site and how these subcultures merged and evolved from it, just for people who maybe aren't as familiar with the site's history?
Sure, yeah. Something Awful is very mad that I put that their title of their I put that in the title of my book. Something Awful was a humor site from the late 90s, and there was sort of this set of dark humor websites at the time, sort of cynical, what I call 90s nihilism, sort of post everything cultural ennui nihilism that was very dark humor. And then there was a forum attached to it, and the forum became very popular. And kind of there's just a peculiar web phenomenon where the forums, for some reason, always become darker and grosser than even the main site. It just attracts people who want to hang out on the internet all day, on forums all day. So the forum became very dark and weird and sort of not really about communication through the ether, communion, right? The early 90s web utopians were everyone's going to communicate, we're going to be webizins, but it kind of became this sort of anti-communication sort of realm of trolling and things like that. And a group of young teenagers, kids who were 14 and 15, were sort of the subclass on that board, found it 4chan. So they said, well, we'll make something even weirder, even grosser. The founder of Something Awful, Low Tax, Richard Kayaka, said, there was some quote that he gave me, 4chan was a competition to see who was the most fucked up piece of shit possible, and they were all winning. But in a sense, the competition started on Something Awful, and it was sort of started in the counterculture of the 90s and just kind of kept going. So 4chan was a combination of Something Awful and then otaku, sort of web Japanese nerdy subculture of sort of celebrating anime and Japanese culture, which was sort of newer, which was the younger generation, who were then 15 or 16 at the time in like 2003, were into, and not so much the older. And so it became the sort of a marriage of a Japanese site, 2channel, and Something Awful. And then 4chan became its own weird subculture of trolls. And it more or less, between Something Awful and 4chan, they invented memes. So the thing that everyone still loves came out of that. And
right,
to me,
because at that time it was like, or prior to that time, it was more like you had certain, like Flash Player you could upload certain video animations to different platforms online, but then you also just had image macros. There wasn't like the evolution of memes in the sense where like people were taking images and copying them and replicating them into different various like styles and different takes on that image. Like at the time it was just images. So then on those forums they started to actually spread them, and they started to go viral and all that for the first time.
Right. So what happened, now I know, I guess. Now it's in the book. Lotex, the owner of Something Awful, the administrator, he banned them. He thought it was not funny if someone took a joke and repeated it and changed it slightly.
Yep.
And then 4chan, the way that it worked was it was much more, the posts were faster, more frenetic, so it kind of was more prone to replicating that meme structure. Mm-hmm. So memes in that sense of reposting and sort of making a variant of a variant of a variant was very easy to do on 4chan, and that's sort of where it came from. Yeah, you kind of asked me to trace the thread from Something Awful to 4chan. Are we going all the way up to?
No,
how far you want me to trace it?
That's good for right now. We could spend the whole podcast tracing it to right now.
We're up at like what is it, like 2008, right?
Yeah.
Now, 2007, right before they became a society of hacktivists.
Yeah, because that's when Anonymous started, and like there was like the financial crisis, and there was all that the counterculture to that whole movement there. But like yeah,
right.
like prior to all that, yeah, I just think it's interesting for people who aren't as aware of like where the group itself came from, because it has such a unique history. And just kind of going back to Something Awful, I don't want to hinge on this for long, but I mean I do think it's interesting. Like I haven't personally read your book all the way through yet, but
Sure.
It's interesting just thinking about like the trajectory that you're following, which is like the sort of like you describe like the dregs of society that are in these deep forums on Something Awful, and those people kind of migrate to 4chan, and then like as this trajectory is moving along, there's new people coming in, and there's people from other different forums and different blogging sites, and they're all kind of slowly finding each other as the internet gets more centralized. But I think one point to make, and I'd be interested to hear your take on this, or if you follow this thread at all in your book. But I know from the one forum on Something Awful, the Fuck You and Die forum. Right. I know that a lot of what is now known today as like the weird Twitter ironic humor started there. So it's interesting, and obviously, back then too, it was like the Wild West of the internet. So the lines between like, I guess you could say like your woke people, like the people that were like maybe liberal leaning, progressive leaning at the time, and then the people who were just like racist and xenophobic and bigoted in various ways. Like it was all kind of blurred together on a site like that because of how outrage inducive it was, and like anonymous, and it wasn't very easy, I guess, to detect like what someone's actual personhood was in reality, because it's all through these message boards. But that said, when we look today at some of the more prominent characters that have emerged from weird Twitter, like specifically I'm thinking of John Hendren is one of the ones, like at Fart on Twitter, and he's like a pretty, at this point, I mean, he's a pretty prominent, he used to be a popular troll online, but at this point, I mean, he does a lot of, leftist commentary and internet culture type content. So, I mean, he's obviously a person of the left, I should say.
Yes.
We'll just leave it at that. And there's other members, too. I can't think of all the ones exactly, but I know there's, at this point, maybe. Yeah. I think Drill, I would definitely paint Drill as a leftist or a left-leaning person behind that account. And then there's also the YouTube scene right now of LeftTube or BreadTube, whatever you want to call it, where you have guys like Sean, I think, was a a Something Awful user and H Bomber guy was one. So it's like
okay.
So it's
right.
you know what I'm saying. But the point being, all I'm trying to get at is it's just interesting how like from that time, like those really really early internet years of like 2000 between even the 90s I should say, but up to like 2004 2005 when FYAD was such a big forum. Like it's interesting to think of how many of the current popular like progressive leftist types also emerge like on like a completely different trajectory from these like 4chan more like fascist leaning, white nationalist leaning type figures. So I don't know if you get into that at all in your book, or if that's something
yes. Yeah.
So is there anything like do you cover like the differences between those two trajectories, or is there anything interesting you want to add in there? It's just an observation I wanted to get your thoughts on.
You put your finger on like a good question, which I tried to sort of untangle that thread, right, where it's very weird, where it looks like there's sort of a lot tangled up there, and you have these sort of very cynical trolls from the early 90s and late 2000 or early 2000s, and they're sort of tearing everything apart, and they're inventing meme culture, and very dark, but of course they're on the left, and then you get this weird switch in 2014 onward, where suddenly there's a far-right troll culture. I try and trace it as a counterculture in the sense that, like, you can kind of go one step backwards and be like, well, okay, well, if Something Awful and 4chan invented memes, well, why, right? Like, why, if they invented them, why does everyone love them now? Why are they still part of youth culture, right? Why have they sort of taken over? Like, what are they? What's the point? Why is that whatever Something Awful invented back then, that sort of culture of sort of tearing everything apart and like sort of like making a big mishmash of culture and like sort of then cutting it to pieces and making it very cynical, like weird Twitter does, right? Why is that still popular? Why do they have 1 million tweets, like followers on Twitter or whatever? And so, I mean, to me, the answer is that memes are kind of a gag reflex, right? The early 90s sort of cynical counterculture was like this idea of like marketing and capitalism, but we didn't really say capitalism back then. We just sort of said marketing was sort of tearing all of our sort of like tearing value systems apart, like in the sense that like we kind of knew we were being seduced by all this advertising, or sort of like told to like this game, or this was cool, or like this magazine was cool, or this entertainment culture was cool, and sort of like there were all these forces kind of trying to calibrate youth culture's value system. So the response was to sort of leave your soul and mind empty, and so there was nothing to steal. So it was sort of like this nihilistic idea that like we're like lobsters at the bottom of the ocean sifting through all the shreds, right? And that's what memes are, right? And memes, you take all those little garbage pieces and you refashion them, and then you get some agency over it. You're like, I'm making my own piece of garbage and like my own weird thing out of all this like scraps of like a Nintendo game from the 90s and like some old shitty Jim Carrey movie or whatever, right?
Yeah, right.
And this is what we live in. We live in this like this psychic garbage dump, which is our psychic space, but also the internet. That's the Something Awful aesthetic, and that became the 4chan aesthetic, and that became the meme aesthetic that is still very popular with youth culture today. You know, in the 90s and the early 2000s up till 2014, this was sort of strongly on the left, but after 2014, after Gamergate, there was really this fragment break, this sort of schism where a great deal of that same counterculture drifted off and said, well, we're sick of what the answers the left has for us. And we want the right is actually better. And the reasons for that, it's sort of the same reasons why fascism grew in the 30s, where it's if your value system is sort of torn apart constantly, and you're like adrift in the ocean, and you're like sitting in your mom's basement, and you have no way to guide yourself, and you've like, you can just sit there and eat Cheetos and watch pornography all day, like, which is what the memes are about. Well, you need like a lifeline. You need some sort of like one set of values you can just go with, and that's it. That's your set. And like conservatism provides that for those guys in a sense. It's a bad answer, but it's like a off the rack suit of values, right? Right. They're like, okay, I know what to do. Jordan Peterson told me a set of rules that I can live my life by, and this is it. Or Gavin McInnes, whatever. The Proud Boys gave me a set of rules, and like so, it's sort of like there was sort of set of first Gamergate. YouTube dads and then sort of just YouTube dads, like guys who are just like they're talking about how to live your life to young men, and that's what they needed. And so sort of like they were using conservative ideology to do that. So that's sort of, I guess, a rough, brutal summary of of how to trying to untangle those threads for you, I guess.
Well, it's super complex. I mean, it's like,
right.
To a certain degree, it's like everything that someone like you or I or anyone who is investigating these subcultures can try to do to unravel the thread. I mean, you're never going to fully unravel it. Like, we can only do our best to create like explanatory power for some of the reasons underneath these movements. And I think one of the things you brought up, which I think might be an interesting take, this is me pontificating, it might have no bearing in reality, but I'm just thinking about it off the fly right now, just how you're describing like the way meme culture sort of evolved, and how there was like this weird switch that happened once the culture war started, and a lot of these like people who were the primary aggregators of like what we would call like meme culture through 4chan and these other deep web forums, they kind of switched to the right. And it's interesting thinking back over that time period and how the right tends to, and this is a generalization, I'm sure this is not, of course, the case in every case, but I think the right as a whole, like insofar as like the people on 4chan, Reddit, wherever, like the culture war right is really good, or has gotten really good at using memes for propaganda to essentially like sow chaos into culture. Like if you look at the most obvious one is obviously Pepe the Frog, and then there's other examples like Ugandan Knuckles, or like that like OK symbol, which was like an innocuous symbol before, but then like they try to hijack it for white supremacy or white power. I mean, so like it's just so interesting to think like on the right, that's essentially the goal. Like the goal is to sow discord and to perpetuate these memes to the point where they go viral and they become trending and everyone is sharing them across the internet, whether or not they know like the origins of the actual meaning, because it's all just, it's to their goal of propaganda. Whereas the left, it's interesting because as a whole, I think when you look at like the weird Twitter types who I referenced before, like the kind of super cyberpunk, media critical leftist types, like they're much more about undermining culture because they're anti-capitalist. So when you look at the types of memes they spread, it tends to be more of those image macro examples, whereas they're not, like, you very rarely see leftist, like prominent leftist or left-leaning accounts propagating a popular meme in the mainstream. Like usually they're creating templates, or they're morphing them into something super ironic or absurd rather than like just pushing the narrative, which I think is interesting because it's like once the meme becomes popular, it's seen as lame to these people who are essentially counterculture. So I don't know, and it doesn't work in every case, because I know like as I was talking, I just thought of an example that kind of contradicts it. Like there's the whole, maybe not, the whole silence brand meme, which originated as like, I think it was silence liberal was the first one, but not from conservatives, that originated from leftist circles, where it was like making fun of neoliberalism essentially. So like there definitely are examples that the left propagates, but I think the right as a whole, when you look at just how the meme landscape has evolved, they've essentially learned the tricks of the trade to create an image, or just find an old image, like Pepe was super old, and just propagate it to the masses to the point where it's undeniable. And now, like, even if someone like you or I shares that meme totally innocuously, we're like on a subconscious or unknowing level doing the bidding of these people, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, the question of like, how co-opt is Pepe. I mean, certainly, now he's problematic, right? No matter what. And you're right. There were some that they sort of grabbed and took and we never got back, in a sense.
Do you think Pepe's come back at all? Like, I feel like I've been seeing it more innocuously a little bit recently, not on any like notable mainstream level, but I mean, I've seen a little bit more nonchalant usage of it outside of those alt-right circles.
Yeah, I mean, I see him on like Twitch streams, right? He's sort of like a emote that is constantly, and I don't think it means his message prior to the alt-right co-optation, which is sort of sad loser guy, right?
Yeah.
So he's just used to express the sadness, which was his fundamental message. So a little bit, and Matt Fury, the creator who I spoke to, like he's made some effort. He made some legal efforts to get him back, but also sort of was sort of the limited amount of artwork that he produced with Pepe. He was like selling Pepe love stickers. Like I bought some of those,
right?
Sort of like. Because he's the only one that legally can actually produce Pepe merchandise. So there is some effort to kind of push back on that. To speak on what you were talking about earlier, in the sense of like the right has an agenda that it's sort of trying to push with memes, and the left is sort of a deconstructionist, deconstruction-oriented critique where they're sort of trying to tear things apart. I mean, I think that's accurate. That's fair, though. To me, the thread that I trace in the book is that what you're seeing on Twitter with these sort of old something awful goons doing that's almost like a little outdated, right? It's like that post-90s or early 2000s philosophy sort of preserved in amber about deconstruction. And that was sort of like a problem the left had, where it could critique, but it couldn't really present a coherent answer. But I think now what's peculiar, what I also note in the book, is that after the Trump election, after counterculture sort of catastrophically split, and there was this now far-right memeing counterculture, there was, in response, a sort of far-left meme, sort of socialist counterculture that was far more about sort of concrete, radical goals rather than deconstruction. So. Right. There are like a lot of memes about like Pikachu advising socialist revolution or whatever. And that's hot, right? That's like super, like I was joking with my friend David that I made the original cartoon with. I was like, you combine Super Mario Brothers or Smash Brothers and like socialist ideas, and you will have like a hit comic. And he just sort of did that off the cuff because he's just a very good artist and works very quickly. And he posted to his Twitter, it was like his most popular comic, and they're like
that's crazy.
Years. So there's sort of like among youth, among the next generation, that's not the something awful generation, people who are very young in their 20s. That's the sort of, if they're not on the far right, they're on the far left. And there is like a lefty poll on 8chan and things like that where those memes also generate. So it's now on both sides in a sense.
That's so interesting too, because like when I think about how like right in the heat of the culture wars, so like 2000, like I remember 2013 is when Black Lives Matter really took off, and then between 2013 and 2014 is when we saw like the rise in feminism on like certain corners of the internet. And then once Gamergate hit, obviously, like, this all became massively spread, and we were seeing a lot more of these, like, college campus incidents where you had a lot of, like, protests, and then you had a lot of counter-protests, and you had the provocateurs, like you mentioned, Gavin McGinnis and Milo. From before, like, you had people like that were creating these scenes and then profiting off the outrage cycle, essentially. And right. I remember thinking specifically in that time period, like I have a few friends of mine that follow this stuff pretty closely, and what we always came back to in that time was how when you looked at the left, at least from a culture war perspective, they didn't have, like you mentioned before, like they didn't really have an answer. Like they didn't have something to give to people. They were only tearing everything down. Like if you looked at what mainstream like feminism or like this, even just like the general like social justice types were doing, the whole narrative was around breaking everything down. It was like, let's break down the patriarchy, let's break down, white America, let's break down like all these, infrastructures and systemic oppressions that like the world or the country is plagued with. And that obviously has its time and place. Like I'm not tearing that down per se, but what I'm saying is at the time it felt like when you look at the masses, like the millions of impressionable people out there, whether they're people who are voting or they're people who are deep in these, kind of provocateur subcultures, there wasn't a narrative to provide people with answers. And at the time, the right was doing that. Like the right was kind of growing through Donald Trump, like in its populism. Trump was like building this whole narrative around restoring America and all that. And slowly at the time, like it wasn't as it was mainstream, but I don't think it was nearly as big as it got in the aftermath of Trump. But you saw the rise of Bernie's campaign, which had essentially the same exact effect on the left, which was the first time I think there was a powerful narrative where people felt compelled to follow this guy because he was offering them something in return. Like, he was offering free healthcare, free college, higher minimum wage. Like, he was basically doing the left's version of populism for people who were like you said, like people who are depressed or in student loan debt or mentally ill or whatever it might be, like just people going through stuff, or especially young people at the time who felt very disenfranchised. They, as the post 2016 election occurred, like that movement skyrocketed with like the Chapo Trap House guys, right, with their podcast, and you just saw this gradually year after year. It was like building blocks where you saw these fringes move out. So I mean, how, like, in your analysis, I guess, of the book, do you follow the through line of like the more like hard leftist stuff, or like is this more of like a focus on the right as like a reactionary force to the left?
Oh no, yeah, I definitely followed both. I mean, I'm on the far left, I guess you could say. At least I'm not a neoliberal in the sense that
right.
I'm very interested in socialist theory, though I'm not I wouldn't say, I guess, like I use mostly the Frankfurt School, Marcuse, and sort of these neo-Marxists or sort of reformed Marx in the book. But to sort of put it in a nutshell, right, there are other narratives. This is not particularly my idea. Other people have spoken about this, but I use this idea of in the 90s, there was the book, after the end of the Cold War, Fukuyama's book, The End of History. And the idea was the end of history was capitalism, was American capitalism in a sense. And the idea was that, like, he's like, well, this is the end, right? We don't need, this is the best system that will ever be. And that was sort of the feeling. The counterculture was sort of defeated, and we could critique and we could sort of complain, and we were full of ennui, but there wasn't really much to say that, like, capitalism was going away after the end of the Cold War. And that really, there were like fragments in that, like I was at Occupy Wall Street, not when Zizek spoke, but he came and spoke, and he talked about that, and he's like, look, this is another common phrase we hear oftentimes, where it's like easier to imagine the end of the world, but then the end of capitalism, right? We see that when we see the end of the world in films, that has to happen first before the end of capitalism or whatever. So this sort of idea that it's impossible to change, right? That, like, it's so ubiquitous, it's like water to a fish. That really disintegrated after the 2008 crash, but very slowly. So it wasn't until 2011, all the way up leading to 2015, 2016. So in the original Fortune essay that went viral, Bernie Sanders and Zizek, they both said the same thing, which was the left and the right are sort of, in a sense, outdated categories, and they're now competing both to see who can be pro-status quo and anti-status quo, and Trump won, right? Trump won that contest in the U.S. at least, and Brexit won it, or at least in the short term. So in that sense, like, those trends are global sort of political trends, but they filter down to youth culture and internet culture, right? Like, you can see where those two components are connected. And then, of course, I mean, you're touching on the Tumblr and the social justice stuff that occurred in the like 2013, 2014, which I also devote several chapters to as well.
Good.
But yeah, I mean, that's another issue, which I can speak about as well if you want. I don't know.
Well, here, let me put it. I'll let you decide where you want to jump off here, because it's so annoying. Like, there's not enough time in the day. I feel like we could take this rabbit hole back so far. I mean, you can trace the roots of this sort of, like, from a philosophical, political perspective back 150 years. And you can also trace, like, the culture wars back even to that time. But specifically, like, I have such, like, a weird contextual framework for this stuff, because I try to trace it back as far as I can to be like, where did this type of behavior start? Where did this polarization start? Where did these ideas start? But I mean, without obviously going back impossibly too far for this conversation, I mean, is there, like, a point where, like, prior to Gamergate, let's just say, so prior to 2014, do you think there was a specific turning point that kicked this all off? Like, was it the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, or was there something else going on that, like, maybe pivoted everything in this direction?
To me, there were kind of a few components that coalesced into what became the alt-right. So from a really macro, zooming out the most, there's two components, which are the economic issue after the 2008 crash. Going forward, there's just sort of this group of marginalized young people where don't have a lot of money, who are mired in student debt, who are not living as wealthy a life as their parents, and sometimes they're very much on the bottom. And then the other component is sort of the cultural, what I almost call, you almost might call a spiritual sort of like, when you're in that, if the counterculture is nihilism, if it's sort of this post-90s, post-everything, we're living in a psychic garbage dump nihilism, well, like how long can you really live there, right?
Yeah,
right? Like it has to move. And in 2008, it moved into Anonymous and the Hacktivist Collective, and they're like, all those 4chan guys were like, we're going to have agency over our lives, we're going to self-improve, and we're going to have agency over politics, right? The inverse of like the sort of 90s nihilism. But then they all got arrested by the FBI, or a lot of them did, and the movement broke up. And then in the wake of that, like right in the wake, right? Like that was 2012, 2013. 2014 is Gamergate. So that's when 4chan pivots to the right. So there's those components. The other component is that the Tumblr piece, so that what happened, for people that don't know, Tumblr is another image sharing community. This one, 4chan was mostly full of young men. Tumblr was predominantly full of young women, so it was sort of like a mirror image. And they were kind of upbeat and optimistic and supportive. That was their culture. But I argue in the book that this Tumblr and other social media set this format where they create this sort of mirrored chamber of self-fascination, in a sense, that is about sort of like creating a very crystallized set of values, which is sort of about identifying yourself and sort of like cobbling together sort of a mosaic of identity. And that philosophy was very much about sort of prevailing upon large institutions for certain rights. So essentially what I argue in the book, it's like the identity politics of the early 90s, which was a consumer product relationship. Mm-hmm. So you say as a consumer, I want you, Benetton, to put more diversity in your clothes or whatever. And then the corporation says yes. And the same thing kind of happens in this redux of Tumblr identity politics, where they say, well, in the fantasy world, can it be fair? Can we have a just world in Spider-Man, in Star Wars, in this cartoon, right? And they're like, and the corporation's like, yes, it can be so just inside this fake fantasy world. And they're like, that's amazing. Right? So, and then it happens at colleges, right? So the kids that grew up on Tumblr, they're at Yale, they're smart kids, right? They're at these universities, and they say, well, here we pay $200,000. We're customers. We don't feel comfortable. Can you get rid of this? Can you change the dining hall food? Can you get rid of these offensive statues? And it's the same sort of format where it's like they're sort of raised in the consumer format to protest that way. And of course, the other thing that happens is that they perceive the world as a power hierarchy where white male, the cis white male, is sort of at the top, which is in many ways true. But of course, that was deeply alienating to the one group, the cis white males on 4chan, who are also deeply disenfranchised through capitalism, right? So,
right.
So they feel deeply disenfranchised. So they can't accept the left because the left now is hyper polite. It's the Tumblr kind of, its culture is about prevailing politely about two large institutions to say, hey, can you kind of accommodate us? And 4chan is the opposite, sort of this early 90s, like we're going to troll everything, we're going to break everything, we're going to break it apart. More of a sort of masculine philosophy in a sense, I guess, or sort of boyish one. So that split happens there for that reason. So that's the other thing. Yeah. So I guess to finally answer your question, this is a very long one.
No, it's great. That's what this is all about.
The big event really was Gamergate, right? That coalesced 4chan from a set of sort of like ideas that they didn't really know that they agreed on to like a formatted political set of ideas that they all agreed on, that they said, okay, well, we're opposed to what we imagine as social justice, whereas we're opposed to feminism, right? We're opposed to representation in games like this, sort of what Tumblr was requesting, partly because they were all losers in their mom's basement, that was their only area of retreat, right? They needed fantasy games. They or at least they imagined they did, right? So Gamergate was the real split to the right, where they realized that they were groping for a set of answers, and they couldn't find it in the new left, and they actually couldn't find it in the old left. But this sort of like hyper conservatism, that gave them like something to cling on to, where they're like, all right, well, if I need to get out of my mom's basement, maybe it's about listening to this conservative like proto dad on YouTube, and he's going to tell me all the things I need to do to pull myself up by my bootstraps.
Jordan Peterson.
yeah, right.
This is so fascinating, and I feel like I don't want you to stop me necessarily, but I'm not, because I haven't read your book, I'm not sure again how much you included on this train of thought, but I'm also, just to tag on to all of that, I got first hooked on YouTube culture, I guess you could say, around, it would have been 2007, 2008, I guess it would. Yeah, it was probably 2007, 2008, and I was kind of getting swept up in the wave of new atheism. And I wasn't an atheist yet at the time. I think I made like a turn in that direction when I turned 18, so it would have been like a couple years later. But I was going down these rabbit holes because I forget, someone from school probably sent one, like a Christopher Hitchens video to me or something like that. And then it's like you just go down this hole because it's endless on YouTube, where you're watching these debates with people like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and Lawrence Krauss or whoever it might have been, like arguing with creationists or Jewish rabbis or like a Muslim scholar or something like that. Like, it's just an endless feed of content. And at the time it was booming. Like, and you and I both know this, like there were best-selling books by these guys, and the movement was like a very strong, like post 9/11 thing, where like there was like this move, like it was like a twofold thing. There was like this move on one hand toward like being critical of Islam in like some subsect of America, but then there was also this like move towards secularism online, because that was just in the same vein of what we're talking about here. I mean, the people who were the most like digitally literate were very affluent and very, in a lot of cases, just nerdy and isolated from whatever community they're part of. So it's like you get on YouTube and it's like, oh wow, here I can relate to all these other atheists from around the world because I live in, nowhere town, Ohio, and I don't know any other atheists. So, needless to say, like, it's just interesting how I kind of fell into that hole around that time, and to watch it evolve over the next several years to the point of Gamergate in 2014, it's like, it's crazy because I can point to specific moments where you can see like these shifts occur when I think. Well, one of the big ones was when Christopher Hitchens died, and the movement was kind of stifled a bit around there. And then there was also that whole incident of what's now known as Elevator Gate, where there was like that, I forget who it was. It was like the girl, she was at like an atheist convention, and she reported like a bunch, I think there was like multiple cases of sexual misconduct or harassment. I forget the exact situation that it was in, but I remember it was a big dramatic thing because it was at this atheist convention, and these were like these holier than thou people who had kind of like built up these digital personas of being like the morally superior beings to like the dumb religious people, essentially. And it's interesting how like that was the landscape for those early years, where it was like sort of the atheist movement was blooming, and all these YouTube skeptics emerged in the aftermath, like what's his face, like the amazing atheist guy, I forget his name, and there was like a bunch of other ones in that time where like these guys built YouTube careers essentially critiquing religion and following this whole movement. And somewhere, I don't have I don't have time to look it up right now, but like somewhere around, I would imagine 2012, 2013, 2014, these guys started to make that pivot toward critiquing feminism and like social justice stuff. So it's interesting how like paralleling this entire amorphous universe that you're describing, where you have like the underground community of somewhere like 4chan sort of fighting the underground community of Tumblr, and these SJW culture wars, where you have like the proto alt-right types, and then these like social justice types, and running parallel with them you had the skeptic community. And I remember like as soon as Gamergate exploded, like you mentioned, we alluded to a couple times here, like Milo Yiannopoulos being one of the most popular ones. Like he was just like some rogue journalist to essentially like build his entire career off of pretending like he gave a shit about video games and just like totally exploiting these people's like angst and being like, I care about you.
Yes, exactly right.
But it's just crazy because like that whole like it diverged into two different worlds then, and like they ran parallel. So it's like you had that 4chan like nest egg getting ready, like it was growing and growing and growing, and it eventually exploded into the 2016 election cycle alt-right that we know. But at the same time, you had the skeptic community explosion where all these people like Sargon of Akkad and Shoe on Head and like Armored Skeptic. There was like all these different huge YouTubers who were also like on this other part of the internet building a massive movement to cater to all those people who are going through the Gamergate thing. So it's like, it is crazy how when you look at like today, what YouTube look like, political YouTube looks like, everybody's still there, and like it's just evolved essentially. You know what I mean? It's like I don't know how much you get into that in your book, but it's such like an interesting pathway that kind of just runs right alongside this whole like anonymous 4chan journey almost, you know?
Oh yes, right. I don't speak too much about the atheist sub thread in my book, though I do think about it often. But the other part, the sort of YouTube part, I do speak to. Yeah, I mean it's wild. I mean to me it's sort of mind-boggling. There's a few pieces here I think that I sort of use to understand it. I mean to me it's mind-boggling that in this sort of mix of intellectuals like Richard Dawkins, he's much maligned sometimes, but his books are fine. He made some very he wrote some very interesting books, but people like Sam Harris I find just to be so foolish, like, and then there's Peterson, who's just incredibly empty-handed, like he doesn't understand these sort of basic concepts, like sort of jaw-droppingly ignorant of things like Darwin and evolution, though he kind of considers himself a social Darwinist.
Right.
So to me, it's sort of like it's just mind-boggling that they're up there sort of spouting their ideas, and that's sort of like a component to it. There's a stupidity to it. Many of these men are idiots, and the question is why. And I think the answer is that the medium is the message, as McLuhan used to say, that a lot of them don't write books, right? If you're a vlogger, you're probably not reading much. And if you don't sort of have the discipline of being a writer, and the audience you're speaking to, they're probably not reading a lot.
Right.
They're just if you're trying to learn about philosophy, about the history of feminism, or the history of atheism through YouTube, I mean, it's like repairing an engine with like a Fisher-Price toolkit, right? Like, it's like, it's impossible, right? You're sucking that through the straw of YouTube. And, I'm a teacher. I teach at university. I used to teach high school. And I understand that if I give most of my students a book, they'll start chewing on it, or they'll be like, what do I do with this? That there's a lot of young kids out there that just have an aversion to reading, but they absorb through YouTube. So it's sort of like that's part of the issue, I think, that these people aren't intellectuals. They don't have ideas. They're vloggers. That's different.
Yeah. So like on that note real quick, do you think that this whole like evolution of the internet in general and how we've kind of evolved at this point to consume video content at such a, and not just video content, but even like rapid fire tweets every day. Like we're so inundated with content on a daily basis that a lot of people's attention spans are just shot. So like, do you think that has anything to do with the sort of like death of public intellectuals? Because like we don't really see that many. Like if you look back to, I don't even know like when the last decade would be to point to, but like the 50s or the 60s or the 70s, like even like Malcolm X, or like like you had like the firing line with William F. Buckley, and obviously Christopher Hitchens was prominent back then, and people like Noam Chomsky, and like there was tons of these people were like revered on a cultural level. And today everything is like someone like you or I who maybe doesn't even have like the credentialed capabilities to be one of these people. Like we could easily mask ourselves as one with a YouTube channel. You know what I mean? Like, it's not that hard.
Yeah. The bar for the YouTube channel is very low, right? I mean, there are still a few people like that, like Zizek, but he's fallen out of favor with youth culture because
he's not woke, bro. He's not
Yeah,
woke,
he's not
bro.
right. Yeah, he opposed, and he's sort of mocking that social justice warrior and sort of all the Tumblr culture stuff he's very opposed to. And then, of course, he debates someone like Peterson, and the internet goes crazy because here he's sort of validating someone like Peterson, who really he's just way out of his depth.
Yeah,
compared
like
to Zizek, right?
it looks like they're 50-50 on a stage.
Yeah, and Zizek's a professor who reads German and has read the works in the original, and Peterson has academic credentials, but he's a psychologist, right? He's not; these are not his topics, and he is sort of shockingly ignorant of all of them. So, and his books too. I mean, I had to read his books, and they're bad, right? They're just sort of confused mush. It's certainly a problem. I mean, has it been a problem for the past 50 or 60 years? Yeah. Is it getting worse? Is the internet making it worse? Probably. I mean, the other piece of this is the Gamergate YouTube dad thing, where after this is sort of unique 4chan history that Christopher Poole, who founded 4chan, got fed up and left after Gamergate. He didn't say that, but it was sort of like a breakup where he's like, "It's not you, it's me. I just got to stop running this site forever." Right. And there was sort of a power vacuum in the sense that they needed leadership, and that's when all of these people realized, like Mike Cernovich, who was giving pickup advice, like advice to young men on how to be men. He rose to fame through Gamergate and sort of realized he could make money through YouTube clicks. Yiannopoulos, very similar. Sarganav Akkad, very similar, right? Another YouTube Gamergate guy who just started in Gamergate.
Yeah.
And these people needed something to talk about after Gamergate ended, and it was Trump. And they sort of became this, and the people that they speak to, right? Yeah, they're not. Some of them are reading books, but that's hard. That's a hard path to go to sort of self-educate that way. And so the sources that I talked to that fell into the alt-right, they just described that they've there's one guy, a young man who was in the New York Times recently. I also talked to him before the Times story. It was very charming when I got scooped. Nice. Caleb Kane, he fell into the alt-right. He said, he had dropped out of community college. He flunked out, and he was living back with his grandma in West Virginia. And he's reading some, he's somewhat educated, but for the most part, he was just looking on YouTube to better himself. And he finds sort of like the alt-right sphere full of these sort of Gamergate guys and other guys trying to make a buck doing this. And they're all kind of hucksters, right? They're not, you talk to them and there's not really a lot of intellectual content there, but it's enough for the audience. The audience, it's like enough for them, but in fact, it's a trap, right? It's like this slippery slope. And he eventually climbed his way out, but only through different YouTube people. We're like,
right. He swung far left then, didn't he? He swung to BreadTube essentially, I think, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there's a competing, like you mentioned, like H Bomber Guy, right? H Bomber Guy is like the other side, right? He is the Twitch streamer, the YouTuber who was on the left and sort of making content about video games and politics and sort of mocking Gamergate at the same time when Gamergate was coming out. And that's sort of become a poll for the medium that the younger generation expresses their politics is through memes and through video games and through YouTube and stuff like that. They're not for the most part, there's less of them picking up Marx or Marcuse or whatever, French critical theorists or whatever. They're not they're not really into Derrida or whatever. So now this is our weird world.
Right. And it's so interesting, just like you said before. I mean, it's so much easier, and I see this in myself as well. It's so much easier to just watch a Jordan Peterson lecture than it is to read source material. For someone like me, and I'm so empathetic to this whole spectrum and this whole cause because, I mentioned that I was kind of involved in the whole new atheist thing. I was also, super into the skeptic community. I was a Dave Rubin fan up until, 2016, I want to say, 2015 or so. He started, right at the beginning of 2015, and I was with him for the first, 30 videos until I caught the grift, essentially, and then I was like, oh, crap, he's not doing the thing that he's saying he's doing, essentially. But at that time, I was always, the first time I listened to another sidetrack, but the first time I listened to Joe Rogan's podcast was in 2011, and I had come from, I was really big into UFC for MMA.
Right.
For people, I trained that, so it was, a natural segue for me to kind of get into his comedy and the people he was associated with. So, I was already on this, sort of trajectory as, an impressionable young guy because I like ideas and I like talking to people about philosophy and politics, and I'm also not very smart. Like I'm smart enough to know that I'm not, you know what I mean? Like I'm smart enough to catch myself at like where I think I belong on like the intellectual spectrum, but I'm fully aware that I'm not like academic grade, or I'm not on the level of certain people that like yourself that teach and that read the source material of like these great thinkers and philosophers. Like I've read a lot of work over the years, but like I haven't had the time to do the deep dives of what I think should be required to warrant that level of public intellectual respect in a way. And for someone like me, when I listened to someone like Peterson, when he first came onto the scene, I was enthralled because I was thinking like, here's a guy, and I came from like a Christian background and kind of left it. So I was like in that like loose spiritual category, and he was speaking to me through like the Jungian archetypes and just how he would like mix together those types of philosophical thoughts and spiritual notions with politics and with, you know, the disenfranchised youth. And like he's really, for all of his like word jargon and his like inability to create coherent thought, like he's really good at creating these just like attractive word salads that put together ideas that are very, very appealing to people who are in these positions like I was in. So I empathize with these individuals on a pretty high level in terms of like how you fall into this sort of thing. And it does suck because even at my own, like right now, like my own entertainment level, like I would much rather jump on YouTube and watch a video by ContraPoints or Michael Brooks or someone like that who's going to be funny and be entertaining and keep my attention span than I would sit down and read through, you know, some Noam Chomsky book like Manufacturing Consent, or like some deep piece of literature that is going to just buy like some German philosopher that's going to take me days and days and days, and then I'm going to get through it and be like, what did I just read? Like I don't even have the contextual framework to fully understand what I just read. Well, so it is tough.
Well, if it's any comfort, there's a lot of French theorists who also create a lot of word salads.
Oh,
so.
Perfect.
And yeah, don't get me wrong. I have been a grand fool for most of my life as well. I'm sure I've been huckstered and sucked into YouTube holes of various sorts as well. I think that's a fair point. Yeah, like certainly. Yeah, I mean, I would agree that, it's difficult, right? It's just difficult to go that other direction and actually read the books rather than watch YouTube or something like that.
I was watching some video recently, just on the same exact note. I was watching a video where I forget who it was, but the person was just speaking about propaganda, essentially, and like how, you know, propaganda in its neutral form, like I guess as a term, is essentially just, you know, propagating what we consider like factual information along with narrative, and it's spun in a way just in order to persuade somebody in a direction. And it's interesting how, on one level, like the quote unquote intellectual side of someone like myself, like I talk to people that are like you, or like people that are in like the rational blogosphere types, where there's a lot of people online that are very interested in having good faith discussions, and they want to argue, and they want the hashtag battle of ideas. Like they want they want to engage, whether they're on the left or the right. They want to engage with like what's going on, and I totally respect it and I understand it, but there's part of me that it sucks to kind of come to this realization, but I think it's true. There's part of me that can't help but think that ultimately, like on the culture war level, like on the grand scheme of the human population that is consuming all of this information, 90 plus, I mean, if not 99+% of the people that are involved are not doing what you just described, like the book research. Like they're participating in the propaganda. Like whether they're on the left watching BuzzFeed or Vox videos, or they're on the right watching PragerU or like Steven Crowder type stuff. Like we're consuming propaganda. So then the onus kind of falls on the individual in a way, but it also falls on the content creators. And that kind of opens up this weird discussion of like responsible platforming that's going on right now, where you had like this whole Steven Crowder debacle where he's getting demonetized, and it's opening up this whole broader discussion about like what constitutes a appropriate channel. Like what is the creator's responsibility? Because when you look across the left to the right, you're gonna find propaganda artists. Like you're gonna find people that are propagating, whether it's socialist ideas or it's like white nationalist ideas. You're going to find people that are trying to persuade the audience that their side or whatever is like the best choice, the most ethical choice, and those lines get so blurry online. But I think in a way it's like really good that it's all kind of bubbling to the surface right now, because it's forcing people to think critically about like where they're getting their information and how responsible are these people and how responsible should we be as the consumers. So I don't know, it all kind of runs along this trail that we're following.
Yeah, I mean, those are some great points. I mean, I think, like you're saying, I mean, they're creating entertainment rather than an exchange of ideas. And what's the most entertaining thing? Conflict. And so there's sort of these battles of like, you have two characters and they're opposed and they fight and one wins and one loses. And this is even more thrilling because the men, like the 4chan men, are sort of defined by their humiliation. So when their side beats up on the other guy and the other person's humiliated because he loses, then it's sort of like sweet nectar to them, right?
Yes, yeah.
And the same thing with the disenfranchised people on the left to some extent. And if you kind of go up a meta level, this whole format is invented. This is the like social media scam, right? These are formats invented by large corporations they all do the same thing. YouTube does the same thing. It's a social media platform in the sense that you start a channel, and then the channel is you, and you're a product, an entertainment product, and you want to collect as many followers as possible. And it's sort of like about your obsession with yourself and how amazing you are, and then the whole game is to collect followers and influencers and clout or whatever they call it on Instagram, right? Same format across all, right? And of course, the idea is that this format, why is it there? Is that it makes a tremendous amount of money. It's very addictive, right?
Right.
Where did the founder of 4chan go after he left Gamergate? Well, he was immediately hired by Google, right?
Yeah, right.
Right. And 4chan was the sort of anti-version of that. It was anonymous. The idea was that they hated that they sort of would tear apart those sort of fake fantasy worlds where the ego was replicated in social media or whatever, and you would get attention for who you were. That was sort of the antithesis of the anonymous movement. But it was also, 4chan also sort of invented a lot of that stuff. They invented the memes. They invented the sort of like idea that the coolest and funnest posts would pop always to the top of this stream. Yeah, and it's like this is the story of the internet. This is sort of larger story of the internet, which is it used to be this sort of like decentralized network where the guys that invented it, they're like, everyone will have their own site. It'll be democratized. But these sort of large corporations are like, well, if we figure out the most addicting thing that will like bring people back the most, we can make a ton of money, and we'll just filter all the traffic through the most addicting behaviors. So we'll like make all the sounds. They'll just be like the sounds that like happen when you pull the lever on a casino slot machine.
Yes, exactly. Right? Exactly. So disturbing.
Yeah, and it's part of the problem, right? Like then you get personalities that are there on YouTube, like entertaining, doing the most, and it's not discourse. It's just like chopped up performance.
And this is also, I think, why the right as like an amorphous blob is so much better at this phase of the culture wars, because they inherently have this reactionary force that provokes outrage in a way that no one on the left can really do. I think the quote-unquote like establishment left, insofar as like your CNNs and your MSNBCs, like they've tried to muster up a similar style narrative in the past couple of years, like around the Trump-Russia thing, and there's been like a couple other one-off narratives where like they're trying to formulate some kind of outrage narrative on their end to feed the audience off of. But this is what the right thrives off of. And like I always tell my friends who are more conservative leaning, like there is no Alex Jones equivalent on the left. He just doesn't exist. Like the closest you could get would be like a Michael Moore or like I don't even know. Like there's like certain people that you could definitely make the argument that they're propagandists or that they're in it for like opportunistic reasons. Like there's certainly people you can find like that on the left, but in terms of just the sheer volume and level of like the ability of someone like Alex Jones to induce outrage, or someone like Milo Yiannopoulos or Gavin McInnes or Ben Shapiro or Steven Crowder, as far as the size is concerned, as far as the influence is concerned, as far as just the ability to manipulate media, there is no one on the left, like no one figure who can do what someone like Milo could do in his prime, where he could just say something essentially and everyone on the left is writing about it. Like everyone is reacting to it. Everyone is like so up in arms. And then of course the right reports on it, and it has this like ping pong effect where it just goes round and round and round, and Milo's popularity grows and grows and grows until it didn't, of course. But it's like, it's just so interesting how, like, in terms of how the culture wars have evolved and how these sides have kind of, like, lines have been drawn in the sand, and it's really, really interesting how, like, paralleling with 4chan's ability to use Pepe and these other memes to propagate and manipulate and get people mad and spread propaganda, like, the same thing exists on the public figure level, and I just don't... I don't know what the answer is, because at this point, and it's the same, we're seeing it now, and I work in social media advertising, and I'm definitely a player in this, unfortunately, but we're seeing it now with brands as well, like in corporate advertising, where you've got like the pseudo-woke corporation thing, like Nike with Colin Kaepernick, or Gillette with the kind of like feminist shaving campaigns they've been doing. Right. And then it's like this trend, and it goes to Twitter. Like I know Burger King just had like their Feel Your Way campaign, which was like very mental health oriented. So like you have these corporations who are realizing the same exact thing, where it's like there's this polarizing political issue. If we take a stand on it, it's going to piss off half our like base or half our population, but it's going to generate so much conversation and so much ad revenue that it just works. Like this is it's creating a splash, and the only way to avoid that is to essentially ignore it. But I don't know if you watch Big Little Lies, but there's this show on HBO, Big Little Lies, and it's all about like this dramatic event that happens in Monterey, and it follows these like 5 or so women who are all friends with each other. And it's just so interesting because like in this season, the one character is like intentionally, she's a provocateur essentially, and she's trying to get these other women to like emotionally react to her by like getting them to misstep, because they're like they're holding together a lie essentially, and she knows that they're holding together a lie. So like her whole object is to just call these little riffs, like make these little snarky comments, and you watch it unfold as like a viewer, and I'm thinking the best thing to do in this situation would just be to not react and like ignore this person and like walk out of the room. But you see the emotion rile up in these people, and you're like, I don't know if I could do that. Like I think I would react too. Like it's just so provocative, and in terms of like a mass scale, like I can't think of any type of solution to counter it, because if the only solution is to ignore them, but like when they're in the mainstream light as often as they are, getting the reactions that they are, it's like, what do you do,
Yeah, I mean, it's funny how much the press has sort of gotten wise to like the Yiannopoulos scam. They've sort of figured out kind of how to navigate it a little bit, where obviously he got canceled and he's sort of never been able to recover. And now they kind of know, like, people stopped interviewing Spencer. It was really post Charlottesville that most of it collapsed, and people were like, oh, okay, these people will go away now. And for the most part, a lot of them did. But of course, it's like whatever drug dealers or whatever, like new ones pop up to fill the void, and the fundamentals, right? The reasons why the alt-right exists are still there. There's sort of still a vast group of disenfranchised people who kind of that philosophy appeals to them. But it's interesting to see how the press, they indeed like realize they're like, oh, actually, we shouldn't cover this. This actually just helps them, but they're just trying to make a buck or whatever. Yeah. It's still like, I mean, I would agree with you that mainstream media as well, like, MSNBC and Fox News is just all. It's the same thing. It's like YouTube. It's like a big performance, right? It's sort of like they make a bunch of fluff to get people really riled up to entertain, but it's not. It's the performance of politics. It's not actually like information itself.
yeah, exactly. And now like we're at a point where it seems like those corporate media sources are finding their way into places like YouTube more and more and more, because as the model dies off, it's like they have to find new ways to get viewership, and YouTube is also a corporation that is looking for advertiser money, and they're looking to appeal to those bases. So like, I see way more corporate media or establishment media at this point on YouTube than I ever have before. So it's interesting how it evolves over time. And in what you just said there, like I'm trying to think, do you ever like imagine a world where something awful or 4chan just never existed? Because like, don't you think like and you just mentioned this, it made me think of it. It's like those people are there anyway, and that's like the kind of weird catch-22 in this whole conversation, because those disenfranchised people are gonna be there, and it's almost like it's tied into this whole argument of who should we platform, how should we platform, and all that. And I think that's very complex and a fun topic to talk about. But it does it speaks to the point where it's like there's always going to be some percentage of fringe people in any society that are either mentally ill or socially rejected, like whether they're unattractive or they're just like maybe just like socially, like they have poor social skills, or maybe they're like more naturally mischievous or bad natured. And they always, at this point with the internet, it's like they're always going to look for like-minded people. Like they're always going to try to band together. So I mean, like, do you think, like, ultimately, like, this wasn't avoidable in any way? Don't you think?
It wasn't avoidable. Yeah, I mean, I guess the answer to that. Well, I mean, there's always a possible world where it is avoidable, but if the idea is that, like, if 4chan didn't exist, if like Christopher Poole hadn't founded 4chan, or if like Low-Tech's Richard Kayaka hadn't founded something awful, would it not have happened? I guess the answer is no. Like, it would have pooled somewhere else, right? Like both those places were like overpass that got full of graffiti or something, or like you described them, like sort of like deep subcultures. So it was sort of like what was happening, what was sort of pooling at the bottom of the internet. And this would happen, right? Like something awful pooled into 4chan, and sort of like 4chan took a lot of something awful's fire, and then 4chan poured into 8chan, and like as they collected at sort of the bottom of the internet, they were willing to switch around, and there were times when 4chan almost went under, and people would create new chans, stuff like that, where the population needed some place to go. But speaking to your point of sort of like there'll always be crazy people, and that's true. And I sort of had to think a little while ago about this, and like Zoe Quinn, who was the target of Gamergate, the game developer, she wrote a book on her experience, and she's like, yeah, there's these sort of places that are full of these jerks and crazy people, but there's something more to that than these places, right? So like that is a contingent. Caleb Kane, the guy who was in the alt-right but fell back out of it, he described it, he's like, which was a good summary, he's like, the alt-right's composed of teenagers, immature adults, and literally insane people, I think, or something like that, right? Like, and that's always the component of 4chan. It's teenagers, and then it's immature adults, sort of men under 40, where they've been sitting there on the site for 20 years. And then there's the crazy people, the people who, no matter what, could never really join society, and so they're on the internet. But that's just a fraction. So the other two, the first two, those are real societal forces that created them, right? Like, if sort of we had this booming economy that helped people from the lower classes, and sort of like there was like a super strong middle class, and it was like a new 1950s or something, right? Would then it have happened? No, right?
Wow, that's such a good point. Right, totally. Right,
that's the real reason. So, I mean, I guess to put it very relatively succinctly, I use Marcuse, who's this a neo-Marxist philosopher who influenced the counterculture in the 60s, and their idea was like, well, this sort of revolution where capitalism got more and more unfair until we reached the 1920s and 1930s, the crises and the wars there and the Depression. It didn't happen like Marx predicted, that the workers united. Instead, we got fascism. That's when fascism was invented, right? And that's why it was invented. That's what happened instead when capitalism got very unfair. And that's why we see it again today. It's sort of the same reasons. That's when it grows. So sort of if there's sort of these underlying economic and social components weren't there, then fortune would be totally irrelevant, right? It would be what we always wanted it to be, which was just like a little piece of garbage full of crazy people at the bottom of the internet.
Right, which is what it was in the beginning, which is what was exactly. Like something awful and 4chan. Like it was just this fringe. Like there was definitely always like some fraction of racism, like other forms of bigotry and all that, but like all in all, it was just a place where people like and I've talked about this with friends, like looking back on those early years, and there's definitely, I mean, maybe this isn't like a full consensus, but I think there's somewhat of a consensus where when you look at the racism and the sexism and the sort of just like edgy behavior of the internet in those like pre 2008 years, we'll say,
right,
it had such different connotations to it than it does today. Like it was so much more like, I remember kids my age were saying the N-word on like Xbox Live, and just those and obviously I'm not like, this should go without saying, I'm not defending it, I'm not saying it's good, but I'm saying like the social weight of those words and like what the purpose of them, like while people were perpetuating them on these forums and these chat rooms and all that, like it was just such a different thing because the internet was brand new and people were trying to push the boundaries of like what was socially acceptable and like how is our language going to evolve in this place. It was all very new, and obviously as time went on and like everything centralized and these groups became more vocal and there became way more like infused political ideology to what was going on, the strength of those words became much more palpable with like hatred and actual like social driven agendas that people had, like we actually want to create a white ethno state, or like we actually want to kick all the Muslims out. Like these types of political movements really became strong, like embedded into the verbiage. But back then it was like there was definitely like your fringe racists, your fringe weirdos that were that bigoted in various ways, but the social weight of those words and like how people exchanged them, I think was just so different. Like, do you agree to that, or is that just like, do you think I'm off at all?
I mean, I think that's fairly true. That, there was a totally sort of different connotation to them. They did not mean fascism. And for the most part, though they were racist, they didn't sort of condone racism in this systemic way that these sort of fascists today on 4chan do.
Right.
Yeah, so it was peculiar, right? Like there would be a lot of the N-word flung around and sort of racist rhetoric, but then 4chan in 2007 they trolled fascists and white nationalists, sort of like just because they liked to troll people and they needed targets, and there was a fascist who was live streaming all the time. They were easy targets, and so there was all sort of assumed that these people were scum, and everyone on 4chan was on the left for the most part, or libertarian, sort of leftist libertarian. And so when it started to switch to genuine fascism and sort of real far right like rhetoric in 2013 and 2014, it was in some ways an easy transition because all of that language, all the defensiveness was still there.
Right.
But it was really, I mean, to me, it's what I touched on earlier, how I described in the book. It's this transition. The early stuff is nihilism, right? It's like, whatever, it's meaningless, doesn't matter. I'm going to throw all this garbage, fling it all around. The words are meaningless.
Yeah.
But then the fascists, like, it's like you're so hopeless, you're so nihilist, and then you're like, I need a desperate way out of this dark hole of nihilism. And like, well, I'll have this insane bloody dream that like all my buddies will be everyone else who's white, and like they'll be my companions because I have no companions, and they'll be my self-definition because I have no self-definition in my mom's basement.
Oh my God, dude! When you frame it that way, it's so terrifying. It really is.
And like, and then it's like that's their rope. They're going to climb out it, right? They're going to be like, and then we'll have this new and what's the dream of well, all of those white people will once again be like upper middle class, like the 1950s again, right? right? That's because they're on the bottom now, and they're like, oh, that, right? And it's absurd, right? It's only you have to get scammed to fall for it. But if you spend 3 or 4 years in your mom's basement after college or after high school, and you're working at Taco Bell, well, it doesn't take much.
Dude, exactly. And that's what you were saying before. Like, it's so much like tied into socioeconomics and the culture itself. Like, even like on a cultural media level, like I think back to those times. I mean, and I don't want to. I'm hesitant to say this because I don't want to paint a picture like all the people who watched shows like South Park were like nihilist, terrible people, but the people that were maybe most obsessed with a show like South Park, or even today, like with Rick and Morty. There's like certain television programs that were coming out around those times too that just perpetuated that counterculture nihilism that you're talking about, and it made it feel like this is reality. Like even maybe it wasn't reality for like this specific person. Like maybe this person is like a trust fund kid, and like they're privileged in various ways, and like they don't have it that bad, but like maybe they're just like internally a little angsty, and then like all it takes is like one element of like from the outside, like of like a cultural force like a South Park to push this like nihilist attitude onto them, and then they're on these like message boards sharing that rhetoric. And like you said, it's so terrifying because on one end, most people, like I don't know what the percentages are, but I would definitely, given that like society hasn't collapsed, I would have to imagine that most people, they grow out of it. You know what I mean? Like most people just eventually reach that point where like they pull themselves up, they get a job, they go to school, they get married. Maybe life isn't great, but like they've moved past this initial despair, essentially, as like in adolescence that a lot of people feel. But there's that percentage of people, man, where like you're saying, it's so like I can't reiterate that enough. Like it's such an interesting point where like the infrastructure of the nihilism was built into these pathways on Something Awful, 4chan, all these different places that have now evolved into like your 8chans and your Gabs and like all these different, or even like certain subreddits. Like there's just certain web communities that share all of that language, but now there's like these culturally dominant forces that provide these really terrifying narratives to essentially be like, here, you've been using all of this language and talking to all these people about all these subjects for years, and you've always been depressed or nihilistic and you didn't really think much about it, but now I'm telling you, like, we have something for you. Like, we're going to give you that purpose that you wanted. And it really is like, it's like a cult, essentially.
Right. And like, I'm not a nihilist. I am an atheist, but I am like I guess I would maybe like a secular humanist. I guess I would describe myself. But there are genuine ways out of nihilism that aren't those. It's just that they're sort of scammed into that one. And I mean, I think the attitude that you're describing from a philosophical, there's words, right? There's terms for this. I would say it's a determinism, right? That's sort of like the accepted sort of cultural idea that, for a variety of reasons, I think through capitalism, but for other sort of cultural reasons, like Rick and Morty and South Park, there's sort of this idea that like, our brains are just chemicals. We're sort of hyperlogical, which sort of connects to this sort of like, there's nothing between us but like sort of this sort of hyperlogical world. There's sort of nothing transcendent in the world, which is sort of like connects to the atheists' ideas in some ways, though not all of them. There's like a particular meme that was on Poll and 4chan for a while where it was, and then it spread out to leftist Twitter and other places, but it was Mickey, it was Donald, and Donald is saying like, there's nothing in our brains but chemicals, and then I think like Mickey's like slapping him, and he's like, well, so what? Like, are you gonna growl? Are you gonna die like a dog? Are you gonna live life right? To the fullest? And that's sort of like that convinced the polls on fascist poll, like all of the people there to like become in a sense like sort of like buy into this nonsense of fascism, but it also sort of like, beyond that, it was sort of breaking a lot of people. A lot of people were sick of the nihilism and sort of this sort of deterministic attitude. They needed a value system, and they were trying to build it out of scraps of memes and pop culture and sort of like a history of kind of dark, cynical determinism. And there's plenty of ways out, but
right.
Yeah, it's strange to see the pivot.
Yeah, and that also ties in too to like I forget if the incels developed it or if they were just like the ones that maybe popularized it, but that whole notion of like taking the black pill, which is like
Right.
in part at least. I know there was like a lot of different legs to it, but like in part there was like the biological determinist element where it was like these people who they have a level, I should say. It's not like they don't exist anymore. Like they have a level of intellect, at least, where they can think through the fact. Like they're very self-aware. Like they're looking through the lens of their life, and they're looking at maybe it's like the way they look, like on an attraction level, or maybe it's where they live, or maybe it's their past experiences with dating or whatever, and they're looking at themselves through this really cynical nihilist lens, but basically thinking like, hey, I don't think I'm attractive. I've gone through the hoops of life. Like I've been rejected so many times, and this is like basically like from that determinist philosophical position, they're basically saying like I didn't choose this. There's no free will involved. Like life essentially, like I didn't choose to be born. Life just handed me this deck of cards. Now I'm here. And then it just like plants you in that deep, deep, dark place where you have those communities, like not just the incels, but like I know we chatted a little bit before we started recording here, where like this has obviously evolved into so many different cases of like shooters and extremists that, you know, have now like pollinated all across culture in like these really scary fringe ways. And like society, like mainstream society is so far behind in terms of understanding it and like dissecting it. Like there's been very, very few research pieces on it that have gone viral in the mainstream. Like there's been obviously like some deep internet type blogs and pages that have covered the topic, but as far as like our parents are concerned, or like the people that like are living normal, healthy, you know, offline lives, like most people have no idea about any of this, but here it is affecting like our society at like the deepest level where people are getting killed over it. So like, did you want to, like, I know you mentioned this before we started recording, and like you had like doing some kind of like work with like these like lone wolf shooters, or like you were like reporting on this in some capacity, right?
Yeah, I have a new piece. I'm sort of waiting for some editors to review it, so I'm not sure where I'm going to put it up. I spoke at length to Frederick Brennan, who is the founder of 8chan. So it's mostly a bio. It's a lot of sort of a description of where he came from and how he founded 8chan, but sets in the context of the 8chan shooters, because there's two recent ones, but also this is in the book as well, sort of talking about the phenomenon of what 4chan calls the beta uprising. But there's sort of this sort of set of young men on 4chan, a lot of them on 4chan, who emulated Elliot Rodger, who was sort of in related communities. So Elliot Rodger was the incel virgin shooter of 2014, and 4chan was sort of delighted by that idea. But there were ones even before 4chan, like even before Rodger on 4chan. 4chan would sort of always encourage its users to kill themselves or kill themselves online, and there were people who would sort of live stream their suicides.
Yeah.
And there was sort of always this worship of mass killers, the Columbine kids or the Virginia Tech massacre. Even back in like 2005, in the sort of cynical way, they were memeing someone called Nevada Tan, who was like a Japanese girl who had stabbed classmates, and she was like in 7th or 8th grade. And the idea was that like, oh, it's just like the violent fantasies in films that we consume, because the reason those are popular is that they're power fantasies for powerless people, right? Like they watch that anime and sort of watch that in violent Hollywood movies, because it's sort of like, oh, you're powerless, but you see all this sort of violence, and it's gratifying because that person has a lot of agency, that person has a lot of power. So they were sort of reveling in that idea, which is sort of cynical, but also sort of related to what was on the other side of the screen. So yeah, by 2015, there was a shooter that came off 4chan. And then in 2017, there was another one in Toronto who wrote about 4chan in his manifesto. And then there was the 8chan shooter, the New Zealand shooter. And then there was a copycat. So it's now become a phenomenon. And really what happened to the alt-right after Charlottesville is that their leaders kind of collapsed, and they don't go outside very much anymore. But it's still there on the internet, and then it becomes a sort of set of lone wolf people who go out and do this, that sort of self-radicalize. Dylan Roof, even the Charleston church massacre, the person who committed that, he was self-radicalized on the Daily Stormer, which was Weave's site. So Weave was the famous 4chan troll.
Right.
Yeah, it's now become a thing, unfortunately. And I mean, I think you're right. It's related to sort of this deep cynicism and determinism that, you're right, is inflected in the incel community. We didn't talk too much about the incels, but this people who are convinced that they were involuntary celibate or sort of doomed to be virgins. And 8chan started in that Frederick Brennan, he was trapped in that, what he called a toxic ideology for a long time. We didn't talk about this much, but the groupthink idea that, so you get a bunch of people together on the internet and they sort of confirm all their ideas.
Right.
And all of that happened with the incel community. And also it's deeply deterministic. So they think that, which is the same as Jordan Peterson, sort of a social Darwinist. It kind of comes from capitalism in the sense that everything is a hierarchy, everything is competitive. Your fellow human beings are not your friends, not your people in your community. They are fellow competitors, like you were a businessman. And so the incels believe they would kind of create these logical charts, and they'd be like, well, logically, like, we're all competitors, we're all like animals, and these animals get to breed and we don't, and like, therefore, by logic, we're doomed to be in our mom's basements forever.
Right, like they would call like the hot studly guys Chads, and then the girls Stacys, right? Like the people that they would never be. They could never attain this level. Like the Chads would take up the now this is all coming back to me now. Like the Chads, they had like the 90-10 rule or something like that, or it was like the Chads of the world. They get 90% of like the hot women or whatever, and then like they get like the scraps essentially, like the incels. Right. Incels have no choice because they'll never get the Stacys of the world. Yes.
Right, and it's absurd. That's not how human beings behave, right? It's hyper-logical, right? It's like a kid's version, and it's like human beings are like walruses or whatever. Yeah. But then you read Jordan Peterson, and he uses that exact metaphor. He says, oh, human beings are like lobsters, and the biggest, strongest lobsters get the most, or human beings are like competitive songbirds, right? And it's the same. Yep. It's the same garbage.
Oh man, such a mess, man. It's like. I don't even know what to do with it. It's like, yeah.
Well, I'm glad I've made you deeply cynical. That was the point. No, it's the opposite. I do think there are solutions. I mean, I think that pinboarding the problem is the first solution. And the nice thing, to have an optimistic note, is that the men in these groups, some of them are dyed-in-the-wool fascists, but they're kind of deeply mercurial and fragile. And like you said, a lot of them grow out of it because they're kind of young men, and they're immature, so they're prone to change. And I think a lot of them, actually, a lot that I talked to, were swinging to the left and sort of like out into more optimistic solutions. Frederick Brennan was sort of more and more to the left every time I spoke to him. Kind of described himself as a recovering libertarian, and that's after he was a recovering incel. And like the idea that, I mean, people were making fun of the idea that all of the 4chan dudes now were obsessed with Yang. But like, I don't have too much, I kind of, the idea that they were all become sort of like proto-socialists, right? Like Yang has this sort of interesting socialist idea that a lot of people hate, but I don't mind that much. I'm not supporting him, but like, it's better than them being fascists, right? Right. Like, they're looking for a way out, and Trump has been an embarrassing disappointment to a lot of them. And like, obviously, I don't think the idea of them becoming alienated fascists for their entire lives isn't going to work out for them. So there's ways to break it.
And this is like, that goes back to that whole, I think his name was Caleb Cain, right? The New York Times guy that was interviewed. And that's his whole thing. I mean, he got essentially pulled from the populist right to the populist left through creators like ContraPoints and Destiny, who's like a, not even like, I mean, it's all arbitrary to a certain degree of how you define leftism, but Destiny is a capitalist to a degree, but he's definitely like a left-leaning, he's critical of free markets and all that. So I mean, he's definitely on the spectrum of what we would constitute leftism, at least on like a mainstream level. And it's very interesting to see, like, I think you're absolutely right, how these people, so many of them are just, they're hungry for narrative. And it's like, someone like a Jordan Peterson is so good at providing narrative. And until the people on the left are providing it, like Bernie provides it from a populist level, but I think his appeal has way more limitations than someone like Trump, just because he's a little older, he's a little bit more, I don't want to say vanilla, but like Trump is just so absurd and so and he's so bombastic. You know what I mean? Like even people on the left agree that Trump is funny. Like,
oh yeah,
like he's
very
just
funny.
he's a character, and he's always been a character in media, whether you love him or you hate him. Like, he's just outrageous. And even though Bernie is he's very motivational, and he's great at yelling in his, like, you know, New York accent, like, it has its own attraction to it. But I think the left needs more public figures, essentially, like a Destiny or like a ContraPoints, who speak the language that these people grew up speaking. And I'm a big fan of Destiny, even though I don't agree with him on everything. Like, when I've watched his videos, like, it's so interesting because he fits into that sort of Chapo Trap House dirtbag left vibe. Like, he's definitely not, like, no, like, ideologically they're not the same, but like, he has the same not politically correct, I don't know, like, it's just not by the book. Like, he's definitely he's more sensitive to it, I think, than a lot of people. Like, he progressively, I know, like, in recent years, he's stopped using certain words. Like, he stopped saying retarded and faggot and a couple other words that, like, over time, his views essentially changed, where he was like, okay, like, this is, like, harming certain people or whatever. But all in all, like, it's great to listen to a guy like that's rhetoric when he does, like, these debate videos with alt-right or white nationalist types, because he's still in, like, if you were just watching him from the outside looking in, you didn't know what his positions were, he speaks in a very similar way to, like, a Ben Shapiro or like an Alex Jones. Like, he's very charismatic, and he talks fast, and he has stats, and just, like, it's just been so intriguing watching a lot more of these stories come out where, you know, people in the alt-right or people in these, like, populist right camps slowly move left because the same exact feeding mechanisms are there. It's like disenfranchised people that, like, the system isn't working for them, and sometimes it doesn't take all that much of a swing to get someone to move that way. It is dominated by who's telling the better narrative.
Yeah, and I do think that's true. I mean, I essentially agree, you know, what Caleb Cade said in the article, what he told me, which is that, like, if it's aggression and like, when he was trapped there in that ideology and sort of people would be aggressive or sort of be disgusted by it, it would sort of push him further. But if you kind of approach and de-radicalize what he's trying to do now, that can actually work, because it's like, it's not like most of them they're young people for the most part. They're not like dyed in the wool. Some of them are. Some of them probably are never coming back. But but for the most part, it's a lot of young people who are sort of just looking to grasp on to an ideology. And like, ContraPoints is interesting. It's funny. It's like not for me. Like, I sort of watch these things a little bit, but I sort of have this, like, anti-gamer, like the opposite of my students, where I'm like, I start playing a video game and I'm like, I really wish I were reading philosophy. I'm like, guys, can I just go back to my book?
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, but
my wife calls me, like, a mega nerd because of how much time I spend, like, reading these types of blogs and long form articles, essays, watching YouTube videos, podcasts. But, like, you're the next level, dude. You're like on, like, the spectrum of nerdism. Like, if my wife knew you, she'd be like, okay, you're not at that level.
When I speak to my friends who, like, actually have PhDs in the humanities, they're like, I feel like the joke. I'm sort of like playing air guitar for what they're doing.
They're like, get on our level. It's just
but yeah, it's ContraPoint. She started out as a 4chaner, I think, from what she's in. I read about it a little bit in my book because she talked about her experience on the LGBT board on 4chan. So the idea, what Caleb Kane said, that, like, she knew the culture and knew how to then sort of, since she understood the culture, she could break it apart, which is actually very rare. So it's actually, I think, important to sort of understand it and where it's coming from.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, man. And I just took a look at the time, and I obviously we've been going on a while, and I want to respect your time too. But we can wind down here. Just a couple more, just quick topics we can hit. Like, I know before we started recording, also you mentioned that you recently attended an alt-right rally, and you got to interview Gavin McInnes. So I don't know, like, how much you want to get into that here, but I'd be interested to know if you found any tidbits of information from interviewing him that would be worth discussing or worth bringing up.
Oh, God. So I did go to cover the alt-right rally in D.C. hot off the presses. I haven't written up yet. I started to write it up, but it's not done. And yeah, these people are in my book, Yiannopoulos and McGinnis, they're in my book. And there's this kind of debate reporters have to kind of think about internally whether it's valid for a long time. And I did think of whether to even talk to the people, but I thought there was some sort of responsibility to ask them at least. And Yiannopoulos got swept away very quickly. He kind of snuck in and drag and left very quickly. But McGinnis hung around, and God, it was a miserable experience. I mean, first of all, the alt-right rally was full of lunatics. It was like 200 people. The counter-protest was much larger. It's usually on the grass in the mall, like when I would go to these things in 2017. But, God, they put it on like a concrete plaza, and it was like 90 degrees, so it was like baking all of these like 200 lunatics, like a brick oven pizza. So this was the crowd. This is the scene, right? There were like people there who were like, I communicate psychically with Prince and Robin Williams, and the Illuminati killed them, right? That's literally what someone said to me. It was like this is the audience, right? So there's like 200, 300 people there tops, and like McGinnis imports like 80 Proud Boys who like talking to them, they can't afford it. I mean, he probably paid or subsidized that trip, right? So he's importing right? So really it was you could see how much it collapsed after Charlottesville, right? How those people are really,
right.
I think McGinnis still has a very large online following, I think. But yeah, I mean, I rarely use the word triggered, but I triggered him when I went up and spoke to him. He got furious. He got very mad immediately. Not immediately. I asked him about his lawsuit against the Southern Poverty Law Center because he was suing them for being listed there on their website.
Right.
And then I asked him about Charlottesville, and that's what triggered him. He got furious. He's like, "There's how many Proud Boys were Charlottesville?" And I said, they were wearing the uniform you designed, right? They're wearing your shirt. We could see them there. And Jason Kessler was a Proud Boy, right? Even though you disowned him, and he said like he was an infiltrator. He infiltrated our group. He got furious, and then he threatened to fight me, or he didn't threaten. He asked to fight me several times. Like, let's fight right now. So what the takeaway is what I already said. That was there a lot of content to what he says? No. Is he a performer? Does he perform by creating like a, sort of a spectacular version of conflict? Yes, right. That's it's immediately what he does, right? So I go there to get content, to sort of ask him questions, and he wants to fight. He's shorter than me. I'm not tall. I'm like 5'8" maybe.
Yeah.
So it was an old man shorter than me threatening to fight me, and I laughed. And that's my reaction. My natural was to laugh. And he's sort of narrating along. He says, "That's fake. It's fake laughter."
Oh my gosh.
And then he says, "That's nervous laughter. You're nervous."
Oh, dude, it's like just from drinking his own Kool-Aid for so long. It's
right. He's been narrating as he goes, and I would kind of look around, and all the Proud Boys are filming, and I'm like, "This is amazing." Like, was I supposed to bring a cameraman to ask him a question? So it was a hilarious experience. It was very, it was genuine laughter. I mean, it was very funny to me. So I think the takeaway there is that there wasn't much content there, right? Like sometimes as a reporter, like when I spoke to Brennan, it was very interesting to sort of these dimensions unfold about the person. Did that happen here? No. I asked McGinnis, like, were you responsible for creating the violent spectacle of Charlottesville? And his response is, why don't you fight me right now in downtown D.C., right? Like, why don't we create a violent spectacle right here, right? And no, I'm not, right? Like,
well, that was your big mistake, dude. You should have like provoked him to the point of hitting you, and then you would have made headlines, and you would have been selling books, and just
he did. He's like, "Get this guy out of here," and like no one really did anything. And I was like, "All right, Gavin, we can be done. Like you're the one mad. I'm not mad at you, but okay." And as I like walk away, he like kind of like. Not like when I'm facing, but he kind of like scrapes his fingers. Like I got like a little brush, like he brushed his fingers against me. Like, it was like a little bit like he really like, I don't know, it's like a schoolyard thing, right? Like I'd never get like, it's like a 1950s greaser movie or something.
Oh my God.
And then afterwards I went into the shade and I hung out with his bodyguard.
Wow.
His bodyguard, he's like he's kind of a proud boy. He's like a big guy. He's very sweet. He kind of had like a sweet face. And like earlier, he's like, man, it's so hot. And he's like, there's a spider next to you. And I'm like, oh yeah, sorry, man. And so like, I was like, I just talked to, Gavin, and he got really mad at me. And he's like, look, man, like, we're not about Charlottesville. Like, this is just like, you were probably about my age. Like, we're just trying to create a community, like, like an old movie, like an old sitcom, like when like everyone took care of each other and like, there was contact, like he didn't say context, but he's like, just like, like everyone knew each other in the community and we went out and like took care of each other's kids. And like, that's been my experience of that idea that he's giving them context, he's giving them community, and it's sort of like a nostalgic 1950s conservative, like the idea of reawakening that idea that like there's sort of these contextless young men who need a value system, right?
Yeah.
But unfortunately, his ideas do nudge up against fascism all the time. So it was a very weird experience. And yeah, this is my life now. Hopefully it won't be my life forever. Hopefully I'll just, we'll see. Like there are dudes who just became alt-right reporters and there was a chance, there was sort of a moment, but I can only deal with so much.
Yeah.
It's so dumb and stupid that I'll have to lose interest eventually. I already have, in a sense.
Well, yeah, exactly. You've had boots on the ground, and you've also spent however many years researching and writing about this topic. At a certain point, yeah, I think that's very true. Unless you're attached by like a broader purpose, like if you're trying to be either, whether it's someone like a ContraPoints who, and I know it's not Natalie's goal necessarily to de-radicalize. I mean, obviously she has higher aspirations of that channel as an artist and a creator and all that. But I mean, there's a lot of people who are they're sewn into this narrative so strongly that it becomes part of their identity, and then it's like it just, whether that's part of their job or it's part of their livelihood. But then for most people, like it hits you like a wave, and you ride the wave, and eventually you ditch it and you move on to whatever the next thing life throws at you. Because I mean, yeah, like with this topic, for most people, especially on like the reporting level and like the research level, it's like how far can you go? Like even in this conversation, like it's so easy to just ramble and just go off and off and off about, pontificating theories on like why these people became the way they are, like what are the strategies to de-radicalize, like what are the best steps societally that we should be moving forward with. I think the topics are interesting, and I enjoy conversing with people about them, hence why I have people like you on the show. But at the same time, like I recognize that it has its limitations, just like you hinted at earlier. Just like a lot of these like anti-SJW Gamergate people, like coming out of Gamergate, they needed something else to talk about. Like to a certain point, like you tackle the subject and then you move on. So I think what you're doing is really good work, and I appreciate you coming on and kind of like contextualizing a lot of these really complicated issues that are impossible to explain, especially for people whose brains haven't been broken by like being extremely online. Like just normal people, like to hear about all this stuff, it's like, what are you talking about? But,
is this right? It's like lifting up a rock.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But like, so just in terms of like your book, we can wrap up here. So like when you got into writing this and got into researching it, and now you've got the finished product and you're getting ready to put it out there. When you look deep down at your finished result and what you're doing now with like media and trying to spread the word about it, like do you have any specific goals in mind that you hope this book sort of like sheds light to, or is this more just something that you were interested in and you fell into it?
Well, my goal when I write nonfiction, at least, is to sort of elucidate and explain and hopefully sort of frame issues in ways that people haven't seen before, and sort of it makes more sense when you arrange them this way. So that's the goal of the book, and I guess sort of always the goal of the writing. And when it was based on that 4chan piece that went viral, and I think it went viral for that reason, which is very gratifying because I've always sort of had that goal. So, when people tell me like, oh, okay, well, I never understood, but now I understand, or like, this is the most succinct explanation. That's sort of what I try and get across. So that's the goal. And I think it is helpful when people understand the phenomenon. And right, you're right that there's a double-edged sword because you want to pay attention to it in the right way. You don't want to sort of platform it for no reason. Which does happen. So you have to be very thoughtful when you write about it and how you write about it. That's the goal, to break it apart and have people understand it, hopefully with the clarity that hasn't been there before.
I love it, man. And obviously just from talking to you, I mean, you've done your homework and you've been deeply invested into these subcultures, which I think is so important when people talk about this, because even like from an observer level, like when I read a lot of the mainstream and even like some of the alternative media reporting that is on, whether it's Something Awful type stuff or 4chan type stuff or just the general, even like the alt-right type stuff, I mean, there's not a lot of great research and reporting, and a lot of times when you read these pieces that come out, you can almost immediately tell if the person writing it has actually spent time in these subcultures at all, or like understands the language and the references and the context that's there. And you see this backlash effect all the time, like with obviously I'm not trying to equivocate necessarily like the example, but like with PewDiePie, the YouTuber, and like he does something that's racist, but then someone like the Wall Street Journal writes about it, and it has this like backlash effect because the whole gaming community just immediately looks at that piece and is like, you don't get us. Like, you're not even close to understanding the broader, like, even if you're right, it's like being morally lucky. Like, you didn't do the homework to get to the right conclusion. So like, we're just kind of completely disregard everything you just said. So it's like, it's really important to have people like you that are actually doing the work and putting it out there for people to understand that you can't spend, limitless hours digging into these subcultures and interviewing Gavin McInnes.
Right, yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, I do think there's a lot of other good people doing work in the field. There's more and more now. I sort of surprised. It's true. As I've gone along, I've been scooped several times and sort of like other people. I'm like, oh, there's actually other folks doing the work. But you're also right. There's a lot of sort of misinformation there. So it is both. But yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. And I appreciate you having me on. Your questions are great. It's a really interesting conversation.
Of course, man. No, it was my pleasure. And I'll include in the show notes links to your book and your social media. But was there any specific place you wanted to send people?
No, that's good enough. If people want to buy my book, I will be happy. That sounds good. I feel like, to me, it feels like, I don't even remember the name of the movie. It's like a science fiction trope where they send the guy into the freaky zone. They like send all the soldiers in, and they're like, all right, they're not coming back, but we got to know what's in that zone. And then like one comes back and he's like really screwed up, and they're like, we didn't expect you back, man. Like, that's sort of like, that's what making the book, where like I came back with the book and they're like, whoa.
You came back.
Okay. You made it back and you have a book. All right.
That's perfect.
Well, you guys can have, now you can have the weird product of that process.
Well, Dale, thank you for going into the depths and coming back with the book. I appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks for having me on.
All right, man. Have a good one.
All right, later.